So how would you define morality? Let's just get that out of the way.
Oh God, the consideration of what is good or what is just. That's complicated. I don't know.
Okay,
Oof.
what is good?
Well, in my case, I would say what is good is what contributes to positive utility in line of achieving your axiomatic values.
Okay, do you think there's like a definition of good that at least describes, like in a descriptive sense, describes what people mean by the word good?
No, unless there's a precondition. So you can say that something is objectively good for X, like maybe you can say, doing this thing is objectively good towards this end, but without the precondition, I don't think there's any way to say whether or not something is good. I think it has to be precontextual. And even then, that's just for empirical stuff. Like you could say, throwing this ball would be good at getting it in the net, and that could be like an empirical statement. But as for the ethics, you would have to have the additional precondition. The precondition would have to be axiomatic, like feeding the poor is good in the context of you believing it good that humans not suffer.
Yes. Okay. Right. I totally agree with you. So the way I would define moral is okay. So in moral philosophy, philosophers never, or at least not in contemporary philosophers, they don't strike a difference between morality and ethics. But if I may ask you, within the context of this debate, can we agree on the definition of morality? This is my own crackpot definition. I don't even talk about it with other people because people get confused. But can we think of morality as the moral, like the normative intuitions people have about what is right and wrong?
So you mean ethics would be the study and morality would be kind of like the default positions we have?
Ethics is about figuring out what is best for you from your own subjective interest. Does that make sense?
I guess I know that like a lot
So
of different definitions get bantied about for this stuff. I've never really like thought that much about the difference between morals and ethics. But for the
there
context
is
of
no
this
difference.
uh,
Right.
or however they're used. But for the context of this
Right.
convo, I can accept your definitions for.
Okay,
Um,
so the important reason why I make this distinction is because, and this is my problem with you basing your morality off of axioms that seem entirely subjective. It seems as if, like, that phrase, and I absolutely hate it, morally lucky, is then necessarily true about every single person who ever even agrees with you or disagrees with you. They just got lucky in the sense that their axioms were determined by their time period. and
yes, I
and when
fully
you try
believe
to
that.
say it, yeah, and that's just bad. It's hard. It's really hard for me to agree with that because I think we can have something better in the form of ethics. Because in ethics, if we agree um, ethics is the study of figuring out what is best for people from their own interest, then we can arrive at more concrete, uh, universal and lasting principles to talk about normative
But
subjects
that makes a
on and
presumption,
with.
right? Then a person who doesn't have the interests of others at heart might not care about ethics at all. The idea that ethics should be about maximizing everyone's well-being is itself an ethical position. Um,
Okay, this is a great point. This is a great point. So, in a weird sense, ethics seems to be egotistical when you frame it like I do, because I can argue for my ethics from a moral egoist position. I'm not a moral egoist, and this is why I actually, in hindsight, once I do all my ethics, I look back and appreciate morality because morality is where really the soul of normative and the spirit of normative stuff comes from. It's that attitude we have towards things. But yeah, that's we're putting the cart before the horse here. So there's two types of ethics then that I would like to talk about. And ethics is what we'll really be discussing then, if that's all right with you.
well, yeah, you're free to go for it. I don't know how much more I can elaborate on my views, though. I do think it's possible to change people's axioms because I think people's axioms are a product of a kind of emotional whim on their part, right? I think that most
Yeah, but
people will believe. So here's an example. We're naturally sociable, which means that most people will intuitively gravitate towards axioms that make them interested in the well-being of others, right? Like it's natural for people to care about their friends and family's well-being. That's a pretty much a biological driver. But tribalism is also a biological driver. So it's also natural for people to have the axiomatic position that their group should be prioritized, that their group's well-being should be maximized, but other groups can suck it, and there are plenty of examples throughout history of people, subscribing to that. The idea of total humanism, like the idea that everyone's value should be maximized, everyone's ethical positions, or like their well-being should be maximized. That's a fairly recent thing, and I don't think many people really believe it. I think they just think they do, because you'll have like liberal humanists who will talk about like universal well-being, but they're also NIMBYs, or like they'll support highways being built through black neighborhoods, and they're also pretty classist and like stuff like that,
Yeah.
So I don't know how many people really truly believe that, but I think it's a good thing to strive towards. And I think people who have active other axioms, like people who believe in the value of hierarchy, like fascists, I think it's possible to bring them over because you can try to appeal to their moral intuition. You can try to point out the world is better, like broadly, without their system, and try to sort of pull them in that direction. But I think you're basically just making emotional arguments at that point. I don't think you can logically convince a person out of a given set of axioms towards another. You kind of just have to like rely on their biases and just kind of like, yeah, I guess like trick them into it, but that's all you can do, right? It's kind of like trying to convince a person to empathize with a character in a film, Like you can make logical arguments, but at the end of the day, like you're making an emotional appeal. Like you're trying to make a driver for like an emotional consideration.
Okay, so first of all, I want to focus on something else. But first of all, I want to point out that morality is not entirely about emotion, and it's not like the only reason why people don't stab people is because they feel inside their gut or whatever, hey, I probably shouldn't stab that guy. And the reasoning I would give behind that is that there are psychopaths who act ethically. Now again, they don't confuse our definition of ethics with
Out
how
of
they do it.
self-interest.
Exactly, and that's what I'm getting at.
But that can't be ethics, because it's in the self-interest of like a Nazi camp guard to keep killing the Jews, right? If we defer to self-interest, what we're really doing is deferring to a proxy, because the goal of civilization is to align self-interest with ethics. The goal is that a person should be naturally oriented towards ethical behavior because it's best for them to adhere to it. You don't want systems to be put in place with perverse incentives where people are incentivized to act in unethical ways. But that only works as long as we're trying to do that, right? Like, for instance, I would argue that capitalism is a natural, like currently existing example of a perverse incentive, where the good charitable behavior, like the ethical behavior, the humane behavior, is not as profitable oftentimes as what self-interest driven behavior might lead to. So I agree, self-interest can guide people towards acting ethically even if they don't care about others or have like no axiomatic roots, or even if they're axiomatically like way the fuck off, But that's because we've structured society to kind of guide people in that way, which I think is a good way. Or I think that's a good thing, right? Like this is one of the reasons why I'm not like an anarcho-primitivist, right? Because I really do think that a lot of our axioms are just down to moral luck, particularly tribalism. So if you didn't have social structures kind of corralling people towards good behavior, I think people would default back to bad behavior, or at least self-interested behavior,
Okay. I think. Yeah, you know what? Screw it. I'm just gonna give my understanding of these things. Present my understanding of all this. There can be said to be an individual ethic and a societal ethic, in the sense that there is individually your ethics. If we keep up with my definition of ethics, individual ethics is when you strive for what you yourself, let's use the language, when you strive for your maximally meaningful life, as in just what would make you maximally happy and living a meaningful life. Sorry, it's late. So that's the individual ethic. The societal ethic is that the individual ethic considered and made compatible with other people. So the societal ethic is when you consider your individual ethic, which is what you're really trying to get at, and then you factor in other people's interests, factor in other people's individual ethics. Do you understand how I'm using ethics here and what I mean when I say individual ethics then?
Well, I know what you mean. I just think that you could only accept that definition as if you've already made some assumptions. You know what I mean? I don't think there's anything wrong with that definition, only that this is kind of like predicated on a broader, more fundamental set of beliefs, a sort of like basic humanism. Because I think this conversation can only really take place after you've taken that for granted. And before that point, the idea of trying to like met all this out, I don't think it would really parse well, you know? There were a couple of first principles we had to establish first.
Such as?
Well, I think like essentially like the idea that there's any value outside of self-interest. People may have an intuitive drive towards being kind to their friends or neighbors or whatever, and their parents and so on and so forth. And we have an intuitive drive towards self-interest, but those only go so far. If you build out a society large enough, like it's pretty obvious where there are schisms between self-interest and humane behavior. Otherwise, we would all be living like monk-like existences where we basically use like all of our excess wealth towards helping the poor or whatever. Like we clearly don't do that. Our self-interest isn't a perfect parallel for moral behavior. It just kind of approximates it, like to an extent. And if we're tribes fighting with each other, then like self-interest might involve like just slaughtering different groups of people so they don't bother you and your tribe in the future, or cutting their throats in the middle of the night, you know? A lot of stuff sort of tears apart at the edges there, you know? And I don't really know how, because like in a practical sense, our understanding of ethics only matters insofar as we're capable of using it to change our lives and the lives of others. There's not really a point in studying something unless it influences our behavior in some way. Otherwise, it seems sort of like masturbatory, I guess.
I
Uh,
agree 100%.
yeah, and we can only argue these points insofar as we can convince other people. But what would these words mean to a Nazi, right? If you were talking with a
Great.
Nazi, trying to make these arguments with a Nazi, you know, I don't think there's any system by which you could logically argue them out of their positions. You would kind of just have to like emotively pull them towards like empathetic axioms. And if you can't do that, which is often the case, you hit them with a rock, you know?